Hi, welcome. Thanks for clicking on the link and giving this presentation some of your time. I'd like to just start off by saying that it is a brief introduction to permaculture design, so it is geared towards people who aren't very familiar or have never heard of permaculture before. I'm not going to be going too deep or specifically technical, so if you are quite familiar and you're looking for some new information, I hate to say it, but maybe this isn't the presentation for you. And other than that, I'm again also not very experienced or confident with talking in front of a camera or presenting in this mode in general. So I'm going to be turning off the camera so that it isn't too distracting, and rather my voice over the slides is kind of the key content which I'd like to share with you. So let's turn this off and move it up here and begin. Right, so something that is quite inherently specific and critical to permaculture in general, which this presentation I hope will capture, is that it's about creating an awareness that can lead to a fundamental shift in how we understand and perceive and interact with our homes and gardens. Specifically moving from a space that is designed and geared towards being a place of consumption to one that is a place of production. And this will be specifically manifested in very different ways according to where you are, who you are, what your goals are. So it's very context specific, and I'm not going to be giving the kind of a direct recipe of how to do this. So it might be in juxtaposition to a lot of the fantastic videos that are being shared for the McGregor Magic Festival as a whole. I don't think, at least, you're going to become a better gardener, but I do hope that you will maybe have a change of perspective or a change of heart in what your relationship is to your garden and to the world as a whole through your interaction with the garden, with your own garden. So let's begin. I'd like to begin with the why. The why is important because it kind of provides the fuel source for why it's really necessary to look at systems like permaculture design. Our gardens have this dark side to them, and that is further compounded by our homes and our lifestyles and how we generally live. So there's this footprint that I think some of us are aware of, and this footprint isn't something that is set in stone. It is dependent on how we provide for ourselves. And we'll see in the next slide that as a species, we're not inherently destructive. It's just that our modern systems and lifestyle are set up in such a way that they promote, often subconsciously, like we're not directly aware of the harm we're causing, but destructive and harmful behaviors and consequences. And through permaculture design, we can change that narrative in a real sense on the ground to something where our footprint is a positive force, is something that we are working towards being proud of and want to kind of share with the world, rather than it being something that we're trying to minimize and remove, because that is an unrealistic end result. We can't remove our impact. We have an impact regardless of what we do, purely because we exist. And if we look at how, we can see that this happens across the board on planet Earth. Every organism has an impact on its environment. It's just that all other organisms have evolved in such a way that they are acutely aware of the principles that govern life on the planet and operate in such a way that they can adhere to these rules, and then the things that they construct are positive or kind of beneficial to the systems in which they inhabit. So an example here, the weaver and the beehive and the coral reef, these are built environments built by other species, and we can mimic how they arrange themselves in a way that allows for our support systems, our homes, our gardens to fit in and integrate with the rest of the landscape and the planet as a whole in a similar way. And this is incredibly exciting for me. I think it touches back to the roots of our species, in so far as indigenous cultures for tens of thousands of years did this exact thing. They observed and mimicked how the rest of ecology built and provided for themselves, and by doing that allowed themselves to create these incredibly sustainable settlements that didn't have a harmful effect and undercut all of these natural systems that we rely upon. Clean air, clean water, healthy soil, regular stable climate, kind of these larger things that we are struggling with now, directly because the way we've chosen to live in is not in accordance to these natural principles. So we obviously aren't in a position to go back to live in a way that resembles how our sort of ancestors lived and how a lot of indigenous cultures still largely live today. But enter permaculture into the conversation, and we can use this design methodology in a way that allows us to take what was observed by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, the co-originators of the concept, in natural systems and indigenous communities all around the world, and marry that with the sort of modern materials and common infrastructure that we find in our homes today, in a way that allows us to then better integrate with the natural world. So if we look at permaculture specifically, it's quite a notoriously hard thing to define, and I think you will find many different definitions out there. And part of that is that it operates on many different levels. It is a movement, a global movement. It is a design process. It is a set of ethics and principles. It's a toolbox. It's all of these things simultaneously and more. And a lot of people who work in the permaculture space find aspects of it that resonate louder than others with them, and therefore their definition is biased towards that. So for me, these two definitions that I found, one from David Holmgren, who's a co-originator, and Robin Francis, best represent the entirety of permaculture. And I think that sets a nice sort of foundation for maybe some of the specifics that we'll go into in the rest of the presentation, which deal specifically with permaculture in the home and how we can reimagine our gardens and homes. Pardon me. So I'm just going to read these definitions. David Holmgren, popularly seen as a cool form of organic gardening, permaculture could be better described as a design system for resilient living and land use based on universal ethics and ecological design principles. Although the primary focus of permaculture has been the redesign of gardening, farming, animal husbandry, and forestry, the same ethics and principles apply to the design of buildings and tools and technology. Applying permaculture ethics and principles in our gardens and homes inevitably leads us towards redesigning our way of living so as to be more in tune with local surpluses and limits. Permaculture is also a global movement of individuals, groups, and networks working to create the world we want by providing for our needs and organizing our lives in harmony with nature. So again, this kind of touches on the fact that it's centered around ethics and principles, which are in accordance with how the natural world operates. And therefore, when we create systems and design systems based on these ethics and principles, we inevitably do good, in the same way that a nest that a weaver creates inevitably is a good thing, for lack of a better term. Okay, Robin Francis's definition is: permaculture draws from the wisdoms of traditional indigenous cultures and weaves this with our contemporary knowledge of ecology, earth science, and technology to create abundance, regenerate the land, and build resilient communities. Human creativity, passion, and innovation shapes the diverse ways people apply permaculture and adapt it to local resources, climate, and cultural context. Every system is unique. Permaculture empowers us in a practical way to explore and realize our potential as positive agents of change, individually and collectively. Living with the challenges of the Anthropocene, permaculture provides a way forward to make our human impact meaningful, to restore the balance by being conscious consumers, to live within the Earth's biocapacity and respect our interdependence with all life. Permaculture is dancing with nature, and nature leads the dance. So again, incredibly beautiful and powerful definition. And it might seem like, wow, this is, if you kind of never heard it being framed in this way, amazing. And it is. And I think part of the appeal for everyone that I know in this permaculture space is that it allows us to have real positive agency in affecting the world. It doesn't frame us as being helpless. In fact, it's the complete opposite. It's based on a fundamental ethical need to take responsibility for ourselves and to do so in a way that is in harmony with our communities, the natural world, and sort of future generations. Right, so they both definitions touched on this idea of ethics and principles. Ethics are at the foundation of permaculture, and they're there for a very important reason. Specifically to ensure that work done in the name of permaculture is work that is appropriate. So these ethics filter our decision making in a way that allows us to rein in any kind of human desire to express our hubris and fall into this trap of trying to do things just because we can, rather than, is it necessary? Are there harmful consequences? Have we thought this through? Do they sort of ethically tick all the boxes? And only then should we really see them as a worthy endeavor. And again, so I would really promote you to try and learn as much and become as familiar as possible with these ethics and these principles, and really try to internalize them and what they mean. Everything else, I think, specific techniques or design tools or processes are important, but to start off with, I think this is where permaculture should, your permaculture journey should, this is the bedrock of it. It should really form the foundation of what you do. And if you really do put time and effort into understanding and learning about these principles and using these ethics to filter your decision making as a homeowner, as a person, as an earthling, we can guarantee a regenerative and positive sort of consequence to our actions. These principles, again, are applicable across the board universally to bees and to humans, to creating tools or designing your home. And each ethic, each principle rather, opens a whole other door into a way of thinking and a perspective that can be applied at varying depths and in a whole huge range of applications. So obviously, if we look at produce no waste, that can apply to, how we cook a meal, to how we plan a holiday, to what we give our loved ones on their birthday. It it can encompass all aspects of our life, as well as, how we make decisions about the way that we set up our gardens and our homes. Right, so this is a fantastic illustration by Brenna Quinlan. Should definitely check out her work. She does an amazing job of very clearly articulating through these fantastic illustrations quite complex and nuanced topics. So in this case, it was specifically relevant to what I wanted to kind of talk about in this presentation, is that there's this tale of two homes. On the left-hand side, we have a conventional home, conventional sort of industrially supported home. And the thing you'll notice is that the supply chains, the kind of inputs at the top, are usually reliant on things that are far away, non-local, energy intensive, and the sort of arrows leading away from the house, not many of them come back to the house, which shows that there is a huge amount of waste that is generated. And the house is acting kind of like an island in relation to the rest of the natural world. Things go in, things go out. It's not producing for itself, and it requires a huge amount of energy and input to kind of keep it running. On the other side, we have a permaculture-based house. And what you'll see is that the inputs are less energy intensive, renewable energy inputs, more locally made energy inputs and resources. A lot of the arrows do make their way back to the property and kind of close the loop on consumption and view waste as a resource to actually invest back into what you do, so that you get an increase in your yield and a return year on year, rather than it being a degrading sort of state of perpetual consumption where you just keep feeding this monster. It also has far more biology, which we'll get to, and why it's important to use biology, and how biology can solve a lot of the issues we have in terms of trying to provide for ourselves in a truly sustainable way. All right, so just to wrap up on the kind of definition of permaculture, it's a tool set. As we'll see in the next slide, we deal with specific design tools. And it's a way of manifesting this image that I'm not sure who created it, but kind of represents, I guess, what we're working towards, whereas removing this hierarchical sort of human-centric approach to how we design and live our lives, versus this more egalitarian kind of, now I've drawn a blank on the word, but kind of decentralized way of viewing ourselves and how we relate to everything else that's happening on this planet. And then on the far left is an image of what I think a lot of people automatically assume a permaculture home needs to look like or will look like. And although this is a fantastic example, it definitely doesn't represent what can be done across the board. This is just obviously right at the sort of the far end. And the magic of this approach is that it is applicable to someone living in an apartment, someone living without a large garden. We can use, as we'll see in the rest of the presentation, these principles to apply at all different scales of habitation. And in fact, when you're starting off, a big sort of setup like this is probably going to be incredibly hard to maintain, in which case you'll be wasting resources because it'll kind of be out of your control. And so, yeah, starting off small and slow and working up, if you're fortunate enough to own a property like this, is definitely a way to go. You don't want to kind of jump in and have everything in one go, as I'll explain later. That's definitely not the permaculture approach. It's not a race to get to kind of have the most systems as quickly as possible. It's really about building a relationship with the land that you occupy and trying to support yourself in a way that is responsible in the truest sense. Right, so some of the design tools to just quickly touch on. Specifically, this slide deals with permaculture zones. So zones are a way of kind of acknowledging how we use space so that we can make energy efficient decisions in terms of placement of certain systems. So on the right, we have zone 0, which is generally referred to as like your inside of your home. And zone 1 is the most frequently visited aspects of your outside area. So it could be, you know, your front door to your car or your driveway, or a particular bench that you often sit at. And it makes sense to put systems that require a huge amount or a very high amount of attention in this area, so that you kind of already are capitalizing on the fact that you use it often. So it doesn't make sense, for example, to have your lettuce or your herbs that you use kind of with every meal, or that maybe are a little bit kind of more needy on the far side of your property or out of your daily commute. Rather put it right where you are already, and allow you to engage with it without really even knowing that you are. Like it's kind of automatic. You know, if you have a row of salad greens on your path out of your kitchen door, you'll see it every single day. You'll be drawn to it. You don't have to go find it, and that allows you to manage it in a very effective way. Whereas, you know, if you have fruit trees, maybe you want to put them further away because you don't need to check on them every single day. And if you have a farm or a homestead and you have a lot of space, you can put, you know, pasture and timber in areas that are harder to access, or areas that you don't really go to that often. Yeah, as the kind of illustration says. And then in any scale, we should have a zone 5, which is unmanaged. It's wilderness. It's where we allow nature to kind of design and build itself, and we take inspiration from that. We can go and just enjoy it. Yeah, it's important, and it can be as small as, like, if you do have a little piece of you know, grass or lawn or a flower bed, let it grow a while. Don't cut it. Let kind of just allow some kind of unmanaged aspect on your property that you can really use as a resource for understanding how what nature is trying to do on its own, and then you can kind of mimic that in the decisions you make elsewhere. On the left is just a demonstration of how these zones can apply to a handbag. It can apply to how you organize your kitchen, your desk. Yeah, so it's, you know, it's kind of what do you use the most often, place them closest to you. Yeah. Next one is sectors. Sectors are another design tool that's often used in permaculture design to map and kind of illustrate what energy flows that are out of your control are operating within and interfacing with your garden or your landscape. So these could be, you know, summer sun, winter winds, summer winds, views, noise, neighbors, fire risks, security risks. And when you kind of map all of these sectors out, it allows you to make informed decisions about placing elements on your property, so that you're not putting, you know, your braai that you use in summer right in the path of a prevailing summer wind, as a simple example. And it also allows you to have a sort of a practice of becoming familiar with how the rest of the natural world that's outside of your property operates throughout the year. So you kind of learn this form of eco-literacy, where you understand where, you know, the first light on the coldest winter morning, like midwinter, where that spot is on your property. You know, maybe you want to put a little place there that you can drink your coffee, and you know where that is. Things like that. Some other design tools, just to quickly touch on. Scale of permanence is a useful tool in understanding how to prioritize things if you're starting from scratch, or if you're in the process of maybe renovating a space. So you have elements that are really permanent, and you have are hard to change, and you have ones that are kind of a little bit easier to change and less permanent. So going from more permanent and harder to change would be the climate of the region you live in. So for us in McGregor, you kind of can't do anything about the fact that we have X amount of rainfall each year. We get this kind of type of wind and wind direction in summer, and in winter we get incredibly hot days. These are maximum and minimum temperatures. So there's not much you can do about that. The landform, again, really hard to change, requires a huge amount of energy. If you were, you'd need to kind of, if you have a slope on your property and you wanted to in some way edit that, you have to do that before you build your buildings or plant your trees. And then water, obviously, again, is connected to landform. Access, where's your driveway and entry paths, and it works all the way down to soil, which surprisingly is quite an easy thing to change, and aesthetics. The design process, in a little summary, you can see that it's circular in nature. It's kind of a naturally evolving thing that is centered around a goal, setting a goal, and that goal is then put through sort of the ethical principles, the ethics and the principles of permaculture, to see if it aligns with those ethics, and if you can create a solution that is in accordance to those principles. And then it's a very observation-based process. So you need to spend a lot of time surveying and gathering information that you then analyze through something like here on the bottom right, which is called a functional analysis. And this is a way of understanding what an element on your property, in this case a tree, needs, its intrinsic characteristics. And when you have an understanding, you can apply this functional analysis to anything: a chicken, a sunflower, a nursery, a swimming pool. You can then position it in relation to other things that will then support it. And this comes from an observation in natural systems like a forest, where all of the elements in the forest get what they need. There's, waste isn't produced. It's a resource that gets used by another organism or system. No one fertilizes forests or prunes. It kind of evolves in such a way that elements position themselves and form these relationships that support each other. And this is what really gives kind of a true sustainable characteristic to these systems. And we can mimic this in the way that we use our garden spaces in our homes. So a simple example would be if you have a fruit tree, let's say a guava, and when the guava fruit is ripe and ready, I mean, it's almost impossible to harvest it all at the same time. You're always going to have fruit dropping. So if you understand that that is something that is inevitably going to happen, you can then design around that. So don't put it, near your car, where your car parks, or you'll create a mess. That's a problem you're creating yourself. Rather, see it as a resource and integrate it with another system. For example, if you have chickens, and they will then process that fallen, rotten guava on the ground very happily for free, without you having to interfere or manage, pretty much, and then generate some other kind of resource that you then integrate, for example, manure with your compost. And so this web of connection starts to develop. And this is where the real magic and kind of power in the permaculture design process comes from, is maximizing these synergies between elements in your home and in your garden. Other kind of design tools that I haven't touched on here, but that are also applicable or widely used in permaculture design, is this idea of stacking functions. So you want something to do many things at the same time, and be supported by many other things. So an example would be, if you're relying on water to irrigate your garden, don't just have municipal water. If municipal water, for some reason, for example, when we had the drought, get shut off, you don't have a very resilient system. But if you incorporate other water sources, rainwater harvesting, grey water, you can create some kind of resiliency, which is inherent in all natural systems. That's why natural systems are quite resilient by, or are very resilient by human standards, because they have this built-in multifunctionality to every single thing that they do. Okay, so what does it look like? One of the things when talking about what it looks like is to describe it in terms of strategies or goals which are universally applicable, and then techniques which are locally appropriate or contextual. And that's where the creativity and the conditions and your own resources and imagination will kind of come up with something new. But we all should be striving with regard to these support systems to achieve these certain specific strategies or goals. So water systems. Strategies include capturing and storing water on site. Use water as many times as possible. So, that's where grey water systems come into place. You also want to make sure that you conserve as much water as possible. So don't be irresponsible with your irrigation. Irrigate at the right time of day, or when there's no wind. Make sure that your ground is covered so that you're not losing a lot of your irrigation to evaporation. Use an appropriate irrigation method. When it comes to capturing and storing water, store it in a tank, or maybe store it in a pond, or maybe store it in a tank and then let your overflow fill a pond, because your overflow is also a resource. If you're storing water, why not if you do have a pool, use your pool as a water storage space, but then allow natural processes that are taken from wetlands to keep the water clear, alive, and useful to irrigate with. You can't really irrigate your veggies with a conventional sort of chlorine pool. So it just seems like there's a disconnect there. If you can clean water and keep it swimmable, clear, and fresh with natural systems, then rely on that biology instead, and save yourself the hassle of doing that biochemistry yourself, and having to kind of keep stocking up on specific chemicals, and then not even being able to irrigate with that water if you need to. Shelter systems. So here again we have a desire to move away from certain manufactured materials or products and rely more on biology to solve these issues for us. So on the far right, you see this clothing line, and we all use this way of drying our clothes because we are aware of how the sun and the wind can evaporate moisture and dries our clothes, and the service is free and passive and doesn't require an appliance or any energy expenditure on our part except for hanging clothes up and taking them off. So there's a lot of other examples where we can use these natural energy flows, or use biology, which is another form of natural energy, embedded energy, to provide these services for us, so that we are not reliant on specific manufactured products. And often it's it's more rewarding and better value for money. So for example, using barbed wire versus a thorny plant like a bougainvillea, you're using a material that has a high embedded energy cost in steel, and huge transport energy costs and emissions, and probably some kind of horrific supply chain story, as is the case with most raw materials in the world today. And it's going to degrade, it costs a lot, it doesn't repair itself. Whereas a bougainvillea does all of those things. It gets better every year, it gets bigger every year, it provides habitat, provides color, it's aesthetically beautiful to look at. So that's just another example how we can rely on biology to create shelter. Use hedges for windbreaks, trees for shade. You don't need kind of very complex materials to shade. Trees have some of the highest quality shade that we know of, and we experience this when we're out in the natural world. And somehow when we make decisions about creating shade in our homes and in our gardens, it's quite common to forget that the efficacy of these natural systems, or using some kind of creeping plant to cool a home by covering the surface of it, or cool your shed, or keep your rain tank cool and cover it in a vining plant, maybe make it a granadilla or something, so that you're getting an edible yield off that at the same time. In that stacking functions, you have a plant that is keeping your water cool and protected, protecting the plastic that is your rain tanks manufactured out, giving it a longer lifespan, and you're getting a harvest off of it. And maybe your overflow is watering that system. So it's all sort of happening and living and evolving on its own, and you're just nurturing it and benefiting from the fact that you made a very smart decision there. Food systems. So food systems are the most popular and probably widely practiced aspect of permaculture design, for a few reasons. One, it's arguably one of the most rewarding systems to start providing for yourself and not be reliant on these long industrial supply chains. I think most of us are acutely aware fantastically now in this day and age of the benefit of growing your own food in terms of flavor and health, and the larger kind of environmental issues associated with how we grow food at scale. So yeah, I think general strategies here again are that we want to produce food on site. We want to do it in such a way that it uses organic methods, promotes perennial crops, builds soil. We treat animals humanely. So these are over sort of arching strategies with regard to food systems. And then specific principles would be, if you do have animals, give them the space and provide the kind of needs that allow them to express what they are and what they do, to live in a natural way, in the same way that we treat our kind of pets. We try as best as we can to allow our sort of animals that our dogs and cats or birds or whatever to really express who they are and their unique personalities, and build a relationship with them. And we should be doing that with animals that we rely on for food as well. Other methods would be quite famously in permaculture spaces, this idea of a food forest, which originated from Bill Mollison, I think, observing how Robert Hart, who's a renowned forest gardener in the UK, gardened. And he observed that if you mimic the way that a forest is structured and operates in terms of how many different types of species interact with each other, you have climbing plants and large overstory trees and young understory trees, and herbaceous sort of shrubs and ground covers and things growing in the ground, and mycelium. If you substitute those for edible species, you can have a garden that produces for itself, that grows in a natural way, mimics how a forest operates, but also then provides a yield that you can consume. So not all of us have the space, or maybe the decades to dedicate to this kind of system. But again, you can use that principle at a different scale. And if you are growing veggies, then incorporate this idea of a guild, which is where you combine plants that are mutually supportive with each other in close proximity, and you don't kind of separate them off. Or in another way, don't have a specific a specific vegetable growing area, integrate the vegetables with the rest of your landscape, grow your peppers in your flower beds, and find a nice balance so that you can kind of mimic a lot of the ways that these plants would grow naturally. Waste systems. So waste systems are, I think, one of the most important and often overlooked systems for us in our homes and gardens. We can really quite easily affect a lot of change here. And I think personally is one of the spaces where true to permaculture ethics, we can fully take responsibility for our actions and what we consume, and deal with our waste. So on the left, quite simply, composting. You can do it with worms, you can do it with hot or cold compost. It's up to you, bokashi, whatever is sort of specifically relevant or appropriate to your space and needs. But we all should be composting our organic matter that we produce in our home. So that can come from our kitchen or from our outdoor space. There's a lot that, I could go a whole slide into compost. I mean, a whole presentation in its own right into composting. And I think there are some fantastic ones already out there in this McGregor magic. First of all, so check those out. And yeah, really just, it's a low-hanging fruit in terms of being a responsible, productive member of this sort of planetary ecosystem in which we inhabit. Other waste systems that are important to acknowledge are packaging related, often materials that we consume in our homes. I'm from a generation that was kind of sold growing up that recycling is the epitome of responsible consumerism, which has sadly turned out to be not the case. And especially with most plastics, there isn't really a recycling market for them. If you follow it all the way to the end result, very few things we assume getting recycled are getting recycled. And so a useful way of maybe coming to terms with what your relationship is with these materials is maybe depending on your appetite for experimentation. For a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month, don't put your rubbish out or your recycling. And let it accumulate, and try think about how you would deal with it if you could never, if what you've generated here could never leave your property. What would you do? And I think the most obvious thing that comes to mind is that you just have to stop your consumption. You just have to stop producing so much of this plastic material. You really, there's a few creative ways you can deal with it, but very soon you realize, okay, it's too much. And that's a microcosm for how we're dealing with our planet. Just because with the recycling, truck takes it away from our property, it doesn't mean that it's left anywhere. This magical land of away doesn't exist. And so I think to be responsible consumers, we have to acknowledge that it really does, it is most effective to just stop to look for alternatives, which moves us on to our third slide, which is specifically dealing with toxic waste materials. And we really should just move away from them as much as we can. Again, if you aren't willing to keep these toxins or poisons in your home, and you really shouldn't, we shouldn't feel ethically comfortable with doing it anywhere else. So relating it to our gardens, a lot of these poisons are, for lack of a better term, just extremely dangerous. There is no responsible use of poison, especially when you have, say, a freshwater ecosystem in your garden. Put a tiny drop of some kind of pesticide in your pond, and you'll quickly learn how dangerous this is, and then maybe it'll help, which I have found, to understand what, some of this ending up anywhere that is a freshwater ecosystem, the damage that can be done. And again, as with plastic, it's just find a substitute. These are really low-hanging fruit, and I think something that we can all quite easily work towards. Again, another little experiment is, if you aren't really on this path yet, and you use quite a lot of conventional cleaning products, is save some of your grey water, or your whatever water you use, your mopping water, cleaning, mopping water, I don't know if that's a real term, and put it on one of your favorite houseplants and see if it survives. And it's likely that it won't. I think it's important to try personalize a lot of these behaviors to our own spaces and the things that we care about, so that we can understand that the harm that it's doing outside of our homes and gardens. Right, okay, quickly, energy systems. I think here it's just important to acknowledge that the sun is the major energy source that all of the natural world works off. And the sun is not necessarily just, solar power, although electricity is important to our modern lifestyles, and we should try find ways of reducing our reliance on kind of electrical consumption. For example, with drying your clothes instead of using a tumble dryer, there are ways of dealing with natural energy flows that will prevent us from using this kind of electrical power supply that comes, particularly in South Africa, from highly toxic and destructive sources. So, an example would be use a tree to cool or shade your property, or a pond that is directed in front of your house that when the warm summer wind moves over it, the evaporative process creates a kind of drop in temperature, and that cool air then ventilates and moves through your house. Or using warm clothes when you're inside your house rather than kind of electrical heating. The benefit of this is that it's much more effective to use biology instead of technology to cool your home passively, rather than using a solar panel and using renewable energy, because once that solar panel, it has a lifespan, ends, it's still quite an issue to deal with the panel that's left over, and there's a lot of toxic elements in there. And obviously it is an improvement to highly centralized fossil fuel energy production, but it's definitely not as good as relying on biology and natural energy flows to find solutions for a lot of the things that we require. And wood is another example. If you're using a locally sourced invasive wood, that's a fantastic energy source and shouldn't be kind of looked down upon. The waste material in the form of ash is a valuable resource in the garden, whereas the waste material coming from a coal power station is not something that you want to be adding to your veggies. And then these don't directly relate to gardening per se, but are incredibly important aspects of permaculture, and I think are important to include. So just to quickly go through: interpersonal systems, social and economic systems, personal empowerment systems, and natural systems. So with interpersonal systems, it's about building relationships in community, having a good, healthy relationship with your neighbors and with your family. These are critical in the same way that catching rainwater are to providing sustainable habitats. Social and economic systems, there's a lot of work to be done here. They are just as destructive and poorly designed as our agricultural system, and often are interlinked in a very direct way. Personal empowerment systems, we've got to be looking after ourselves, our own health, our state of mind. As if we kind of acknowledge that we are part of the natural world, and you want to look after the natural world, it's starting with yourself, as well as your home and your garden are kind of different scales of the same thing. It's just as important. And then natural systems, if you are fortunate enough to have your property border a natural system, a river, a mountain, a wetland, a forest, become a steward of that space. Learn as much about it as you can, and don't try to intervene in that space. Work rather in the spaces that have already been affected by human decision making, and rather just value that natural space for what it is, and don't go putting fruit trees in your indigenous forest. It's not necessary. There's places where it is appropriate, and if you again use those ethics, you would understand that decisions like that are not actually in accordance to this permaculture way of living and designing. So where kind of spoken about this already quite a lot, but for me, I think why homes and gardens specifically are so important is because they are, if we think back to zones, they are our zone one within the whole sort of world as a space. They're the place where we spend the most time, where usually we have the best ability to directly change things. You know, it's the lowest hanging fruit, and also a space where, like I explained with the support systems, where it directly affects us and involves us, and so the decisions we make, we can immediately see the results because it's, you know, it's happening right outside our front door. And when I say home, I mean garden as well. You know, a garden is arguably sometimes the largest room in our house, and should be viewed as an integral part of kind of all the other activities that happen in our home in terms of how we provide for ourselves. And when you grow food and catch rainwater, you do start to see that relationship forming between the kitchen and the garden, or the shower and the garden. So that's an important thing. And then when, and I would say when, tomorrow morning, when the sun rises. I'm not sure when you'll be listening to this talk, but in some way start to, I hope, internalize what I've shared here. Maybe do some more reading, watch some more videos. There are a wealth of incredible personalities in this space that have decades of experience at all different sort of, in all different areas and scales. And it's growing and it's an exciting space. And I hope that you can immediately start to reimagine and analyze how your home and garden is set up, what you rely on, where you can make interventions, and kind of get the ball rolling. It is important to note, though, that a big mistake that most people who begin make, which is understandable, is that it's very exciting and there's a tendency to overreach and try to do everything at once. And that is totally counterproductive, again, to these principles. One of the principles is actually slow and small solutions. So you want to gradually build up momentum. You want to have a lot of early on small successes. You want to be able to manage everything that you've started. So for example, if you're going to start growing veggies for the first time, just start with 1 or 2 plants even. You know, have a successful harvest. Get incredibly familiar with that plant and with how plants operate, and a lot of very technical information that might kind of come out of problem solving. As anyone who has a vegetable garden or a garden in general knows, that it's a lifelong process, and this is as well. So rather, you know, a small garden that is well maintained is far more productive than a large unmaintained garden. And then, yeah, just to kind of jump back to that, to remember it is a journey, and it's a commitment. And I think the only way that there really will be real change resulting from using permaculture design in our homes and our gardens is to acknowledge that there is no end result. We can never tick all the boxes. It's just a constant relationship building process. And like relationship with anyone in your life, there will be times where you fail. There will be times where the relationship changes, where there's fantastic times, you know, harvest periods where it's a celebration and you feel incredibly rewarded by your efforts. So it is important to acknowledge that this is a journey and not a checklist. And yeah, I wish you all the best, and thank you for listening to this presentation. Please go out and read as much as you can. I recommend going back to the slide that dealt with the ethics and principles, and finding as much information out about that. And then, yeah, find ways that you can make positive changes in your own home and gardens. And from there, start to think about what appropriate and locally contextualized solutions would look like to these overarching support systems and strategies and goals that you're trying to work towards. Some sort of easy place to start is, if you haven't, start a little compost pile, maybe get some worms, grow a veggie for the first time, or something edible, maybe even a herb, make a small pond or some kind of freshwater habitat in your landscape to increase the biodiversity, and allow you to have a direct relationship with the animals that kind of share the space with you. Stop using toxic chemicals if you can and where you can. Yeah, kind of all of these different things. Capture your waste and enjoy. I think something that I might not have that I've included, and just to end on as an important note, is that it really is designing our homes and lifestyles that are far more closely connected to how we evolved to be, and what naturally supports our physiology. So not only will you be doing good, but you will feel better in a whole range of ways. And I'm really excited that I got this opportunity to share this with you. And please go check out Brenna Quinlan's work. She has a whole range of fantastic illustrations on permaculture topics that are really easy to understand and might be incredibly helpful. So thank you for your time, and have a fantastic rest of your day.